And I'm just waiting for the confirmation that we're streaming here from the site. Good. Okay. I'll call the Joint Policy Committee to order at 5:06 p.m. Members in attendance, John Stinson and Christopher Parkin.
I will call the Region 9 special meeting to order on December 13th at 5:07 p.m. Members in attendance are Sarah Lieberger, Kathy Thompson, Cheryl Graziano, and we have our ex officio here as well.
Thanks. So just to orient everyone for the agenda tonight. So we have this is a special meeting, which means we'll follow the agenda and we won't have the luxury of adding items. After call to order, we have the approval of minutes for two separate meetings in the past: public comment, committee member comment, discussion and possible action, where we will take up a few items on our to-do list in terms of policy. So if we want to start with the approval of minutes, I have each of them here. I would note one correction for this one. I think we did have members of the Region 9 Policy Committee in attendance with a quorum. Was this not a noticed meeting? Is that why this is not also noting that the Region 9 Committee was meeting here? I remember that was something that we had an issue with. I
believe Region 9 did not notice that meeting, and I believe
that's
it was
right.
a joint meeting for which they were attending.
Yep. Okay. All right.
That's right. I think that sounds right.
That is what happened.
Okay, good. So no correction from me on this one. Any corrections, Chris?
No concerns.
Okay, and we'll consider that approved by unanimous consent. And then we have our September 23rd, 2022 meeting. Any corrections or adjustments to this one?
No concerns from me.
Hearing none, we'll consider this approved by unanimous consent. Sarah, do you also want to approve by unanimous consent on this one?
Sure. Approved by unanimous consent for Region 9.
Okay, very good. We'll move to public comment. I don't believe we have any members of the public currently on, so we'll move to committee member comment. Any comments from committee members? I will say happy holidays to everyone in case we're rushing on the way out and don't have time for committee member comment there. Happy holidays to everyone. I hope everyone is going to have a really good end of the year and has lots of time set up with family and friends. All right. If there's no additional committee member comment, we'll go to discussion and possible action items. So we have our policy review process. I wonder if, Sarah, do you want to take the reins, or I'm happy to drive, or I know you've done a lot of work with your committee.
Sure. If you can drive in terms of spreadsheets and whatnot, that would be great.
Sure.
Just because my computer is not having the best day today.
No problem. Is this the spreadsheet we should be on?
Yes. So that was the
Good.
last one that we worked on. And then basically Region 9 had gotten together and we wanted to take a look at everything from the other spreadsheet that Dr. McKinnon had provided to us, that they were working to update themselves. And that way we would get that on the school websites and everything. So we looked at that from a legacy policy standpoint, which happened to be towards the bottom of the list. If you don't have that anywhere near that you can pull up, that was.
Is it maybe the approval tracking?
Yes.
At the bottom of the approval tracking.
Exactly. So you've got it right there.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Not the approval tracking. What is it we are calling this one?
It's under to-do tracking, column R, around 24 to 32, it looks like.
To-do tracking? No, I'm sorry.
There's legacy items, I don't know.
Okay.
Right. I think that suffices, but I was referencing the one spreadsheet that we had where we had all of Easton on one column, all of Reading on one column, and then Region 9 on another column. And at the very bottom, you see that Region 9 had a lengthy list of legacy policies. So we just wanted to go through that and see what, if any of that, we could bring to the table at one of our upcoming board meetings. And what we decided was that we really needed to have Shipman and Goodwin review this list. So that way they could tell us what we can bring back to our board and say, after legal review or council's review, we recommend that these policies be brought forth for a first reading for repeal. So through our process, what we did is we had all of these old legacy policies, and then basically they were just kind of on hold. We didn't get to review a lot of this substantially within our group. So these we're going to need to go through. Once we hear back from Shipman and Goodwin, they're going to get back to us early in the new year. And then what we would like to do is bring them ahead to Region 9 and say, you know what, the work is still being done on the side, but here's the list that Shipman and Goodwin have gotten to us. And this is what we can do to repeal these and continue moving forward in this process. But hopefully that's something that we can do without holding up what we are doing here within committee as well.
Okay.
Hopefully all of that made sense, but this is something that we need to do separately from our work with you both here.
Okay.
And so that way we can continue on with the process and keep things moving forward and efficient.
That sounds good. So as we think about the work that we do want to sort of do together, and I think the last time that we got together, we had prioritized the Shipman list of sort of new items, and we had prioritized the sort of the items that we had left off. Is there anything the Region 9 committee has done specifically with relation to those two categories?
No, I mean, and Kathy, feel free to jump in if there's anything that you think I'm missing here, but the bulk of that meeting that we had was really looking at a lot of the legacy work.
Yes, we did. We actually pulled from that list for Shipman to review the policies that we were still working on together, the big buckets that were still outstanding, transportation, purchasing. There were those big buckets that together we've been working on. So the policies we looked at were really the ones that were no longer, you guys have repealed them. So they weren't repealed from Region 9, but they were repealed in Easton and Reading. So those were the ones we were focused on.
That makes sense.
Shipman's feedback.
That's great.
I know that there is that one policy that Dr. McKinnon had mentioned the last time he attended, which is the non-resident students, which as it applies in particular to employees of the districts. Region 9 did not repeal that policy, but I guess Dr. McKinnon noted it because in Easton and Reading, it seems that it was repealed. And because they're all linked, because if someone went to Helen Keller, for example, they can go to Jill Barlow, they're linked. And so that's one issue we need to make sure stays on our list because it's currently not covered adequately in the current policies.
And forgive me, I think I was following everything until the end, but is it that Region 9 needs to do something to make that gap up, or that Easton and Reading need to?
It's that currently Easton and Reading don't have a policy in place to cover those students. And ultimately the policies work together because Helen Keller and John Reed Middle School students might in theory move forward to Barlow.
Okay.
So even though the policies were specific to the districts, if there's not a policy in place in each district, Dr. McKinnon was concerned.
Okay. Does it make sense for us to take a look at that right now and look at whether or not we should be bringing that to our respective boards? And Chris,
I think there's some nuance here because the legacy policies, I believe, were different. And they were also subject to discussion with different bargaining units, if I'm not mistaken.
Chris, just to clarify, the legacy policies were different between Easton and Reading? Is what you're saying?
That's my recollection. It's been a while since I looked at it closely.
Okay, if we start with Region 9 policy though, could that perhaps serve as at least a jumping off point?
I sort of recall having a conversation about these policies a longish time ago, in the prior sort of iteration of this work, where there had been a discussion about trying to align them so they made some more sense, and because it depends where you work, what your impacts are, and what the reciprocity is up and down with Region 9. I just don't remember what the numbers in those policies were. So I'd be happy to look at them, but
Well, and it may be, I don't know how, I got the sense from Dr. McKinnon that there is some need to have this in place because it affects it is happening right now, and there's not a policy in place currently. So possibly a simple short-term fix, at least, is to reinstate the Easton and Reading policies that were repealed. Possibly, at least there's a policy in place. But I would leave, I mean, I don't want to presume that's,
Might it be helpful, and I apologies for joining late. I don't know if we had more guidance from the administration with respect to exactly what is needed, because to me that might be something that we can ask administration to indicate what's needed to really reflect what we're doing now, Kathy, to your point, and then whether that it's written in a policy that was repealed or the Region 9 one. It's really administration saying us, okay, what do we need now to reflect what we're doing? And that could be an interim fix, or it could be the long-term adoption.
yes, I think you're right. I think if Stephanie or Dr. McKinnon were here, they could give us better direction as to what their immediate need might be.
so for clarification, I think it's going to require going back to administration on its policy 5118.2. And in Easton, the prevailing policy had been that non-resident teachers pay tuition in their children's enrollment in Easton at 15% of the annual tuition rate established by the board. Non-resident certified staff employed by Region 9 shall be allowed to have their children in Easton at the same rate that is applied for Easton staff. The enrollment of children of non-resident staff employed by Region 9 in Easton shall be subject to stipulations of Board Policy 5118.2. In Reading, it's 20% and has a similar stipulation back to Region 9, but the numbers are different.
And it looks like Region 9 is also 20%. I'm looking at 5118 for Region 9 right now.
That's how I read it. Yes.
Yeah.
Region 9 has been 20% for a number of years. I think going back historically, Reading at one time did charge non-resident teachers, and then Easton, I wasn't sure what their policy was, but Region 9 has been, I think, 20% for a number of years, and I think Reading then did change.
Yeah, we changed to 20% in 2018, and I think it was to create consistency with Region 9 at the time.
Yeah. But I'm still a little unclear why the policy for Reading or for Easton, or the lack of policy would affect students coming into Region 9, other than not being, parents not being aware, staff members not being aware that it's different at Region 9, which I think that's a problem, creating that awareness. If this was out there, and we should probably make sure that they're aware when they're registering their children. But I don't know that there's a legal problem of different policies in the different districts, because again, looking back historically, there was a time when Reading didn't charge, and then they came to Region 9 and they had to pay 20%. And Easton still seems like they're somewhat different. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is potential value in saying, do all three boards want to go to a 20% model and just have a single policy that says that staff in Easton and Reading shall pay 20 and have reciprocity across all three, just so it's a consistent single approach for administrative efficiency.
Mhm.
probably better for staff members too, to know what
Right.
their expectations are going to be every year, you know, to have it continuous, I think is
Yep.
fair.
Yeah, so I would say, if we put here, let's go. There's our link. Oops.
Is that a typo in the first heading line?
Where?
Children on? Or is
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it. Yes, unfortunately.
The Reading and Easton policies are children of, so.
Okay, so we'll link to this, and I think we'll bring this to Dr. McKinnon.
And I think if we're able to have a joint recommendation to a single policy to go back to all three boards, that's probably a positive outcome from this.
Yeah, I'd say why not, unless there's some kind of nuance that we're not aware of that the administration is dealing with.
Yeah, I think typically the nuance on these things are families who have been grandfathered in for a variety of reasons and have certain expectations, and how you phase in changes to minimize the impact to particular cases.
Yeah.
I think that's why in Reading, the policy has an effective date, which is sort of a year after when it was passed.
Yep.
Good. Okay. Good. All right. So that gives us a nice to do. I think Easton and Reading to review that and make sure that we don't find anything else that causes us concern. Taking this to the administration to make sure that they have any feedback that's accounted for. Good.
So the one that was up on the screen, that was the Region 9 one, or was that?
This is
yeah.
the Region 9 one. Yep.
So can we fix the typo, not quote tuck, or how will you say that, Chris?
Yeah.
And,
I think that's clearly a Scrivener's error that will go on the list for when the website gets updated. It will also get updated with it. So.
Oh, speaking of the site, does anyone know if the administration was able to update the site for all the policies that were adopted across all three districts? I haven't checked, to be honest. I was actually looking.
Not that
while
we
we
can
were-
find.
Not that I'm aware of.
they
Yeah,
had-
it's
I spoke to them today, and there's a new website coming. Unfortunately, we have one person that's doing everything, and I think, you know, I think that's in the works. It's just how, you know, how quickly we can push that work forward, given the other demands of the position.
okay. Good. That we're going to call that progress. Sarah, did you have anything else?
No, not on that. So that was it. Regarding those, let's see. I think the next thing we could discuss potentially is wellness.
Okay.
An update from Stephanie Pearson-Ugal that was sent to me and John and Chris. The ER9 Wellness Committee had met in November. They discussed and approved a draft wellness policy, which includes the needed updates. Please add a discussion of this policy to our work. Let's see here. So if you, John, just for
I have it
ease-
open.
Okay, great. I was going to say November 11th, if that helps.
Yep. Just one moment.
Sarah, do you know if they worked from the Shipman model policy, or did they revise the existing policy incorporating Shipman updates? Do you know?
No, I'm gonna forward this to you right now, actually, and then I'll pull it up.
I mean, looking just at the format, it's the existing policy with revisions.
Oh yeah, the header says.
Yep.
Yeah, I see now.
I mean, this screams existing CABE formatting
Yes.
and verbosity.
Yeah, so I think today, if we look at the new and deleted, and then map this to the, not to do today, but then as we come out of here, we map this to the Shipman policy, and then consider whether or not we believe that you could take the new and deleted concepts and embed them in the Shipman policy. Does that make sense?
I think
Kind
so.
of.
Kind of, yeah. It depends, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So just looking, yellow is new, and I'm going to call it turquoise is deleted. So a relatively innocuous, right, along with state and national standards. I don't think anybody finds that shocking. Instead of can provide, schools and communities support numerous opportunities. Instead of encourage at the elementary level, we say require schedules that provide time to the extent possible within every school day for students to enjoy supervised recess. We have an addition of strongly encourage recess to be outdoors. And we move from strongly discourage to disallow the cancellation of recess to make up instructional time. We also see
Disallow instead of prohibit.
yeah, right.
Disallow seems like a tax term.
Yeah. Yeah. These deductions cannot be from your instructional day. You make too much money. Instead of strongly discourage, we say disallow. I think the point is that law now enshrines certain parts of recess and the student activity time to be guaranteed to the students, and that it can't be used in a punitive fashion, right?
I don't see any turquoise in this document, so I assume the strike through
I think
is
that's right.
indicative of what's been removed.
That was my inkling too. I encourage opportunities for physical activity. So this is a pure addition to the additionally physical activity outside of physical education classes at the middle and high school levels. Pardon me. And we have a number of strike throughs here under the nutrition education wellness promotion, along with national and state guidelines, which I think is consistent with what we see above. Wait, I just want to double check. Are we into regulation here? No. Okay. Striking nutrition education curriculum shall be based on theories and methods. So the entire block is cut. And then we're looking at consistent with state and federal. And then starting this next bullet with include nutrition education, and striking nutrition education focuses on skills, including but not limited to reading food labels, and menu planning. And then the addition on this last bullet, including but not limited to nutrition and health posters, signage, or displays in the cafeteria, food service, and dining areas, classrooms, hallways, gymnasiums, and/or bulletin boards. And then we're getting down to what looks like comments from or links coming from members. Is that, do we know if
It's
Mike?
from the Barlow staff.
Mike
Oh,
is
I
on
see.
John Reed's staff. Yeah.
Is he?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I assume he's just linking to the updated dietary guidelines, which is why it changed from 2010 to 2020.
Yes. Is that how often the guidelines are updated?
I have
Yeah.
no idea. It looks like this is a 5-year update based on the
Right.
link. I'm just
Right.
guessing that we never updated the policy for the intervening 5-year period.
Yeah. Looks like we have the addition of a paragraph here. Schools will provide opportunities for developmentally appropriate and culturally relevant participatory activities.
I mean, frankly, just thinking about the dietary guidelines for Americans, I'm not sure why we don't just say the current version of instead
Yeah.
of putting a year, because we'll be out of date in 2 years again.
Right.
Yeah.
The new ones come out.
That's a
And
great point.
we could say the current version of which can be found.
You're gonna need to link it. It's a defined thing. The current
Right.
versions of blah 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 as may from time to time be amended.
Right. Yeah.
Makes it an evergreen sentence.
Yeah, I guess I worry about striking the balance between helping to answer the questions of the person who's trying to understand what the policies are without having them, run all over the place. But especially if this is available via the government dietary guidelines website, something like that.
Right. If we assume that dietaryguidelines.gov will always exist,
Right.
which is an assumption,
Right.
when you go just to that website, it basically exists to link you to the PDF.
Yeah.
So because we're going to live in a dynamic world, you could theoretically just hyperlink dietary guidelines for Americans to dietaryguidelines.gov and be done.
Yeah. I like that.
But just for clarification, this policy that we're going through now, that's the old CABE policy that the Wellness Committee put comments in?
It appears to be, yes.
Correct.
Are we throwing them back the template from Shipman and saying, FYI, even though, the leader of your committee was in numerous policy committee meetings, you seem to have used the older template, and here's the new
Well, I
template.
don't think they used an older template so much as they revised and updated an existing policy. They don't think we're tasked with conform the Shipman policy to current
Didn't
practice.
you know we're going to the Shipman policy?
I think there was if I'm remembering correctly, Mike, I think there was a timing issue here where when they started digging into this, they needed to do it by statute or, based on when their next regular meeting was. And we had not come to this one yet. We had not approved this yet.
No, I realize we didn't approve the wellness plot. We kicked it down the road because we wanted to give them time to be able to look at the new policy or the template. And they were going to meet and come up with their recommendations, but it seems like they made their recommendations and put them into the old policy.
I mean, the good news is that the Shipman policy looks nearly identical because it seems to all be pulled from statute.
Okay. So, and
I'm
that's
looking at it now.
That's what I was proposing is we right now, let's, continue looking through what was struck from this and what was added. And then offline, one of our to-dos could be compare that and sort of this policy in total against the Shipman policy. And if we find there to be sort of relatively small changes, then our recommendation back to the Wellness Committee, I think, is we want to use the Shipman one. We don't have any issues with your additions, but we want this to be based off of this one. So send it back to them to say, please take a look at this now and make sure that this all sort of matches with your expectation.
Okay, and then I'm sorry to go on, but so this policy that you're looking at would be for all 3 districts? Is that what we're doing right now?
Right, that's what currently exists as a joint ER9 wellness policy, correct?
Okay, so if it is, then again, I do have some preliminary concerns with language that says we prohibit things when there could be a situation where, let's just say you're doing standardized tests or something is going on and something happened, there was a fire drill in the middle of the day. In order to finish the test, the only way to do it is to kind of defer your recess or whatever that. I mean, I think that putting prohibit or disallow is very strong and could get us in trouble in a.
I think you take that up with the legislature in Connecticut General Statute 10-221-0, which is cited and basically says thou shalt not take it away. I don't care what you need to do.
And yeah, so,
Or
but
I
I think,
suspect that was discussed in the context of the wellness committee. So I'd rather than, I mean, maybe
Yeah.
rather than debate it now when I'm assuming, I didn't watch the minutes of the wellness committee, or the recording, but I'm assuming that they had a similar discussion. So rather than retread old grounds, perhaps we can just direct those questions to them, because it has to go through all three boards
Well,
anyway.
and,
Right.
and yes, and I would also say this may be something we want to refer to Shipman. Because the wellness committee is not the legal expert, right?
Sure.
And I think this is largely a function of how do we meet the statutory mandate while also allowing for the scenario that seems like a pretty likely scenario, Mike. And this is not, the scenario you're describing seems likely, and it has nothing to do with some kind of punitive situation where you're trying to punish a kid and take away his opportunity to move, or her opportunity to move for the day.
I think we're all saying.
And the statute required a policy to exist to prohibit taking recess away on or before October 1st, 2019.
Yeah. So,
Um,
yeah, so I'm sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
Well, I was just gonna say to the paragraph that says surroundings for eating, it does say in there the high school campus will be closed, meaning that students are not permitted to leave the school grounds during the school day to purchase food elsewhere. Dr. Almeida did recently, he did propose allowing some of the students to leave campus. So this would need to be relooked for
Right.
Barlow.
Yeah, you're
That's
right
great
about that.
feedback.
From the spring when they were allowed to leave campus. Yeah.
I don't believe we're doing that anymore. I think that was a last semester kind of exception thing, but you're right. We do need to be aware that if that comes back.
Because that's the existing policy. Did the board waive the policy, or did the administration try to waive the policy last year?
It wasn't a formal waiver from what I recall, but
Yeah.
Sarah.
I mean, it's a liability issue if something happened in that circumstance, because the policy is explicit what the board is directing.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
Also, I would think that it makes more sense to separate that item from this policy. This policy should be more about nutrition and wellness.
Right. I believe most of those off-campus things were after lunch, but I couldn't guarantee that, but I thought that's what they were.
Okay. So I just want to peruse partnerships with community health agencies or organizations for school wellness activities will be encouraged as appropriate. We see the addition of field trips to the list of things that could include but not limited to, according to state guidelines. And that looks like it's actually trying to achieve the sort of the spirit of what you often try to do, Chris, is instead of saying shall be biannually, it'll simply say whatever the rules are, that's what we'll do. Yeah. Collection of unpaid charges, acceptance of gifts, donations, and grants. So this is just
Statutory reference
to the statute. Yeah.
Which
Okay.
I assume was just amended to get rid of the shame tax, basically.
Right, but I don't remember us seeing anything in our highlighted version. So either we already accounted for that well before the legislature told us we needed to, or we're missing it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're going to really have to do a comparison.
Yeah.
The Shipman and Goodwin one.
I think that's right.
I think it'll be a bit more updated, especially with their recent updates that they sent us.
Okay.
Should we flag anything, any comments or questions that we all had in this doc? Is that the best way to do it? Or just flag it in that tracker?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I was thinking that we would add this so that we would take this guy and put it on our to-do list here and then link to it and then tell us all that our takeaway is to compare the two. and I'll find the link to the Shipman version. Um, Does that make sense? Yes. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Is there anything else that?
My internet was cutting out, but John, did you see I sent you the link to the Shipman version?
Oh, thank you. No, I did not see that. Is it in the chat? Ah, awesome. Thank you. Okay. Anyone have additional items? Anything else that we had on our, either on the back burner, or anything we sort of came in here that we want to try to accomplish today?
Well, do we want to, I know at our last meeting when we were all together, we had started with the budget procedures and line item transfers policy, and Chris had been volunteered to take a crack at revising the Shipman policy to reflect our 3 districts, and he did do that. Do we want to discuss that, where that stands right now? We had agreed that we would start our review with that one policy.
And I think there are some sort of big rock questions in there that we should get a consensus on what we would recommend, as to how we define sort of category items, and as to what thresholds we want to be looking at, because it's been some time since we instituted any of these thresholds. And, you know, I think there were some comments in the policy also where Kathy and Cheryl, I think, had made some efforts to align the policy so that they could work for everybody. Let's see. Because the Shipman policy, there are 2 choices. There's a regional and a local. And it looks like some efforts have been made to try to align them. But the big questions are how we want to think about these category items, and whether we want to put specific budget numbers or object codes in there. I would be hesitant to do that just because you don't want the numbering system to change and then have that change the policy. If substantively everything otherwise is sufficient. And then here the question becomes, what's the intercategory transfer number that is authorized in an emergency? Are we keeping the transfers between categories at 10,000 requiring advance approval? And here, I believe I just added this to understand practice. It's not from any template, it's just made up language to reflect sort of what I understood to be an intent in the current policy with respect to hiring, because the current policy says something about accept transfers that add head count or something like that. Is a little bit awkward, but I think this is the understanding. So I don't know if we want to start with low-hanging fruit and say that an emergency 12 years ago might have been $25,000, but an emergency today, it seems like $50,000 is not an unreasonable threshold.
Just to clarify for me,
Mhm.
how is an emergency defined? For example, what does define an emergency that would necessitate an immediate authorization of $50,000 by the superintendent? What might that be?
Would it be something that threatens the sort of operation of the school? Like, not if, let's say we need heat, or we need or there's flooding, or
I think it is a less of a likelihood in the post-Zoom era than it was in the pre-Zoom era. Whereas if you said that a tree falls on the building on June 28th, and you need to hire some folks to come in and fix the pipes that have all exploded as a result of the tree falling in the building, you need to do what you need to do to make the work happen. And if half your board is on vacation because it's June 28th, you're not going to be able to get any authorization. So you've got to do what you got to do. In this day and age now, with Zoom, you can meet on 48 hours notice, and it should resolve a lot of the theoretical emergencies, I would think. This is different than the building is on fire, how are we going to have school tomorrow, which is an operational emergency meeting. This is a how are you going to spend the money, and it's somewhat unlikely that you're going to have to spend the money on that short notice when the board can meet so readily now.
yeah.
Well, but to Kathy's point, I would ask if there's a way that we can somehow put some guardrails around it, notification to the board chairs, something, because unfortunately, even in the era of Zoom, we did have a situation under the previous, well, the finance director, twice removed, two finance directors ago, we did have a situation at Region 9 where they transferred and allocated funds for, I believe they were pole vault mats that were older pole vault mats that were still being used, but they wanted new ones, and they transferred the money, they bought the new ones, and they said that it was an emergency because it could be health and safety of the students, and it did not really go over well with the Region 9 board. And so again, I don't want to make it, too complicated and try to put these crazy guardrails around it. I'm just saying, if there is a way that
I think there's
something around it to stop that.
So there's two pieces to that, Mike. The first is to your first comment about communication. The emergency requires immediate communication to the board writ large. So beyond just the
That's
board
even
chair,
better. Yeah.
as well as written explanation to the Board of Selectmen for the local districts, because that's from statute that you've got to tell everybody when you're doing this. So, you best be sure it's an emergency. And as far as guardrails, I think one of the things that this kind of gets at is, what is an intercategory transfer? Because we get a budget that has lots of line items, many of which are within the same category, and you can transfer freely within those regardless, because that's not an intercategory transfer requiring approval. So that's what kind of gets up into here, which is what are the broad categories, and getting some resolution understanding as to what the categories are that we are siloing to then create a transfer permission requirement. Because it's like, to use the pole vault mats example, which I have no idea about until 2 minutes ago. In theory, if that were all under the broad supplies category, and they transferred from cleaning solution to pole vaults, there's no requirement that it get approval anyway. Because there's no policy that says thou shalt spend within the specific line without saying what's going to happen. So that's where I think it's valuable to go through the exercise of understanding how wide or narrow the guardrails are going to be in this policy as to what these buckets are that are high.
Right.
And it's a comment without a proposed solution.
Yeah, it's a challenge because my struggle all the time has been, interpretation here, because while again, I believe the spirit of the law allows for intercategory transfers, because if you have an item that goes over, or an emergency or something, that allows you to kind of shift money over. I also feel like there's kind of a fine line between non-budgeted items. And it's weird because you could say, well, technology is budgeted, is an item in the budget. So there's a technology budget. But if there was a desire to buy 100 new iPads, that clearly was not in the budget, even though technology is part of the budget. So could you transfer from heating oil into technology and buy 100 iPads? Well, I guess technically you could, but that's, I think, where it gets a little dicey, is that you want to make sure that everyone has a clear understanding of what a required transfer is, and then not make it so burdensome that it makes it
And I think this is also where the granularity of the budget process is a double-edged sword, because when you to use your 100 iPads example, right? So the administration comes to one of the boards and they says, next year we would like to spend $50,000 on technology, and we'd also like to buy 100 iPads. That's another $50,000. We'd like $100,000 for technology. And the $50,000 base technology is to fix and repair things that we anticipate in the normal course are going to need to be cycled through. And the board says, you can have your $50,000, but you can't have your $50,000 for iPads. Sorry, you just have $50,000 for technology. And they get into the year, and it turns out that they don't need to replace these things that they thought were going to degrade or that were going to break that typically do. And they come to April, and they've got 40 of the $50,000 left over because they didn't have to replace any of the things that are broken. The board and the taxpayers have allocated $50,000 for technology. So the question then becomes, do you say no to the administration about buying 80 of the iPads then? Because if you say that, you're going to be in a perpetual cycle where you're never going to budget for them and you're never going to procure them. And you're also not incentivizing not spending the money. So it's a fine line around how you treat that and how much discretion you give vis-a-vis how you can make iterative updates to the quality of the program by finding cost savings in the allocation, while at the same time not encouraging padding the allocation.
Right. And I think you're right, but I think the key part of that too is that I think it should still be like the board decision. And I think in that situation, if there were the 50,000 or 40,000 that was still in the budget line, and the administration came to the board and said, we have the 40,000, we would like to purchase the iPads or whatever, I think that's okay. I think where it gets a little opaque for me is when there's no guardrails around it, and then you come back in the next year's budget cycle and the board says, well, so what happened? Do you want to buy those 50 iPads or those 100 iPads? And then the administration says, oh yeah, we had 40,000 left over last year and we already bought 60 of them, so we only need 20. I think that's where it gets a little.
And this is why it's a double-edged sword, Mike, because you start talking about 50 iPads and that becomes an issue. Whereas if you just say, I'm putting $25,000 towards the library, nobody knows which books are proposed or not proposed, and it gets done or it doesn't get done. And so you're creating attention-seeking issues where you don't necessarily need to, in the interest of being granular and transparent. So there's a put and take there that there's no great solution for.
It's a tightrope. You don't know which, because if you put too many guardrails around it, it makes it too hard. But if you don't have any, then there is, still the possibility. And I don't know, I know many of you would come back and say, well, we hire the superintendent, so if they do that, we just, make it clear to the superintendent that that's not something that we're in favor of, I guess. But the reason I seem a little sensitive was because the example that I gave you actually did occur, and we were told after the money was spent. And so, that gets uncomfortable because we are supposed to be the stewards of the taxpayers' money. And so I think we probably would have bought the pole vault mats anyway. It's just
Right.
being clear.
In an attempt to try to translate what you're both saying into words in the policy, Mike, a question with respect to the audit recommendations, right? And Chris and John, I know this was made in the context of the special audit that Region 9 chose to do, right? Not Reading or Easton, but there were a number of what I'll call management recommendations, policy recommendations, right? And Sarah and Jason had reviewed those in depth during a Region 9 board meeting. I don't know if there's anything that's codified, like a specific recommendation that the auditor said, hey, you should pick, I don't know, $50,000 or whatever the number is, right? Because that at least is substantiated between, based on an independent audit, if you will, and it's not at the mercy of people's different interpretations of what is good governance or good line item review, right? And so maybe that's something, and to the extent that Sarah and Jason said they have a kind of an implementation plan for some of that, then maybe that's what we hook the transfer number into, right? So I think that might be worth, considering, rather than, I like the $50,000, it feels okay to me, but the same token, Region 9 has been hit because we are our own board of finance. We have been hit with these one-off things, and you're like, well, wait a minute, why didn't you just look at it holistically and just buy so, I see both sides of it, or we could make this easy and just use the lowest number, which is the 10.
I mean, you can also you can include a definition of emergency. This is a bona fide emergency for which the board is unable to meet within 72 hours and the funds must be expended. Like, it'll narrow the field real tightly.
I like that because I'm not the least bit concerned about our current superintendent, our current director of finance and operations, but imagining a future in which, board members without our experience and history are hiring new superintendents, 10 years down the road, and not so focused on operational competency and integrity as we are. I think you could find yourselves in a situation where somebody is making some pretty awful rationalizations to find their way to using 50 here and 50 there and 50 there.
Well, and actually it could be a 60 really, because you've got the 10 that's enter, and then you've got the 50 transfer. And I'm just it's hard for me to imagine a true emergency that is under 50,000, that's $60,000. Like, to me, a true emergency would be potentially like the oil in the water at Barlow, to me, was an emergency, but it didn't require use. It didn't require this. It didn't trigger this.
Right.
I'm just having trouble imagining an emergency that would require this. I
also, there's a such thing as an emergency meeting of the boards. FOIA allows for emergency meetings under certain circumstances. I wonder if we should simply sort of mirror that language, because I mean, I agree with the sentiment that if we have Zoom, I don't know what situation, like, we don't have to notice an emergency meeting. We can't use them for anything except real emergencies, but we should be able to jump on in 10 minutes if Jason says, a school's burning down right now, and for whatever reason, I need to meet with you. Like, I feel like we'd be able to do that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, because a true emergency would be, like you said, an emergency meeting unnoticed that was, I think that gives it, that really emphasizes emergency. Pole vaulting mats aren't an emergency. I can't imagine, like, things like, people might have different perceptions of what an emergency is.
Yeah, and I think the only way that pole vaulting mats are an emergency is if you literally don't have them as someone's going over the bar.
Exactly. I know
Right.
that can't be
And
solved.
you're not gonna cut that check that quickly anyway. So I just threw some language in here as we're talking about this. Emergency circumstances shall mean a circumstance that imminently threatens life, safety, or the integrity of the physical plant, and for which the board is unable to meet within 72 hours of learning of the circumstances.
And for me, if that's the situation, I find it hard to believe that $60,000 would fix it. Like, to me, that sounds really bad.
I mean, I think what it might be is I'm throwing $50,000 at somebody just to show up with their equipment to start the work.
Yeah, and you could
Okay.
imagine an emergency that affects the entire Northeast. And it's a function of first one to tie up the contractors and so, hey, I got to cut this person a check for $52,000 in order to, now we have them for the next several weeks.
They're not turning on the engine to cut the trees down until they get their check.
Right. And so, but it's not necessarily writing the check, it's committing the district to the expense, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so the only other question I would have, is there any circumstance where there would be a legal situation that they would have to commit to something? Again, I don't know. I'm just trying to.
Oh, sure.
I would think the only example I can think of is you're talking about a special ed settlement, for example, and you go to a mediation or you go to a due process hearing, you get hit with or you agree to pay an amount that requires a transfer. I still think that you make those settlements contingent upon subsequent approval, and the superintendent acts as the representative of the board in those circumstances. And if he or she is unable to allocate the funds, he has the opportunity to say it's contingent upon finding the funds.
Yeah.
I think there's ways around it.
Yeah, I could also imagine like a ransomware situation.
Mhm.
But again, like why can't we meet? Why can't the board meet?
Right. That's why I think that the technology situation helps alleviate most of these use cases.
And is there any statutory reference for any of this?
Yes, this all comes right out of statute, especially the Board of Selectmen notification.
Right, but also the language about emergency circumstance, the transfer, is that in any of that in the statute?
Is the emergency
In other
Talking about
words,
the dollar value, right, Mike? The 10 or the 50. Mike's asking if that's
Yeah.
codified in statute.
I thought that the 10 one could fluctuate, because I know there are some districts that go to the extent of making it $5,000, and I think there was one that had $2,000 that require approval, but I don't think we're looking to do anything like that. I was just wondering, I thought that maybe the 50,000 was in the statute or
So
something.
here's what the statute says. Boards may, by adopting policies and procedures, authorize designated personnel to make limited transfers under emergency circumstances if the urgent need for the transfer prevents the board from meeting in a timely fashion to consider such transfer. All transfers made in such circumstances shall be announced at the next board meeting, and a written explanation shall be provided to the legislative body of the municipality or to the Board of Selectmen. Expenditures by the Board of Education shall not exceed the appropriation made by the municipality. It goes on. That's the section
So
about.
it's even more broad. It doesn't put a dollar amount on it.
Yeah, we narrowed this
Okay.
from the statutory language that permitted. I mean, you can say that if you don't have a policy about it at all, it's prohibited. The statute allows you to pass a policy to allow it. If you're silent, it's prohibited.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of like the language clarifying the emergency. I think that helps, like John said, in the event that, there are board members that are newer board members and we have different administration and, and I don't think it makes it too burdensome, just to, further clarify what emergency means. They still have the same authority, so.
I think I like the addition of that language too. I think it just clarifies.
I agree.
It basically says you've got to have a situation where a quorum of board members are out to sea when this happens.
Right,
Like,
right. Yeah, I like that a lot. I think this is, that's nicely buttoned up.
so then, I mean, the number almost doesn't matter if we've walked this back so tightly.
Yeah.
Can I, just a point of clarification, where it says the board, that would be the individual, if it's an emergency at Samuel Staples, that
Right.
implies the Easton board.
Mhm.
Do we
Right.
need to be more clear? This would never, I guess what I'm getting at is, would this ever be a tri-board situation?
It could, right?
So do we need to clarify the language around what board?
Yeah,
What instance would there be where it
Right.
would be a tri-board
If we-
situation? Like, I'm trying
if
to
we-
think of like
if we own
possible.
The director of finance is held hostage.
yeah, yeah, or look, ransomware hits all of us.
Well, yeah, that's
If
fair.
it's hitting the ER 9,
Systems, yeah.
domain. Also, if we bought a central office, if we owned central
Central
office or
office.
something, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff,
Yeah. If we
I would
remove the location
hesitate-
of central office, yeah, okay.
right.
I would hesitate to put tri-board into the language though,
Doesn't exist.
because then it'll be super specific to tri-board meetings. And I'd rather have us have the flexibility like it
Yeah.
states right now, that it's the board and it can be any of the boards or all of the boards.
Yeah. I
Depending on,
mean, we have this, I mean, this probably for whatever we adopted across all three districts, I think we used that generic board, didn't we? I'm just trying to think of the other ones we adopted. I don't think.
Yeah,
we
but I
specified-
think that this is somewhat different to that because there's a circumstance where you could have an overlapping emergency situation that would require action by multiple boards under a similar policy.
You could just say, I mean, this might be even easier. The first line, require the advance approval of the boards, and then put an apostrophe S, or the respective board or
Respective,
boards.
Mhm.
I'm agnostic, whichever way.
How's that? Transfer to $50,000 under emergency circumstances where the impacted board or boards are unable to meet quickly enough. Strunk and White are rolling in their graves over it, but
Why can't it just say the way it was before? I'm not,
why can't what say what it was before?
the impacted board is unable to meet. Why does it?
Because there might be, I added impacted because there might be more than one board impacted.
Yeah, but if that's so, then the same policy applies to both boards. It's still, I don't think
Here's an idea. In the event of emergency, the impacted boards shall endeavor. Well, no, you can't even say shall endeavor to meet jointly because you get a situation where it's an emergency for one and it's not for
Right.
the other because one board can meet and one can't.
right.
I was even going simpler to that, like in the first line, transfers between categories, intercategory in excess of 10K. Then you could even pull in that 50K in that, right? Requires advance approval of the boards.
And then this is about emergencies.
Yeah, respective, except.
I think it's got to remain singular because each policy is going to be, the policy is going to be in each one of the policy books of the board.
Well, and-
It's no different than being a tri-board situation where if we needed to meet, it's three separate meetings, held simultaneously, but you still would do it and it would still have the same impact, I think.
Well, and actually, it refers to the budget, not the board, because any district has their own budget. So this would be a transfer within each individual
With,
budget,
Yes.
not,
that leads me to maybe something we weren't thinking about is,
Central
Could
office,
say what?
central office budget.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about taking 50 from each of us.
Hmm.
Right? Is there that hazard that we're creating?
Yes, in as much as the emergency impacts all three, like the bus is lit on fire and you own
Right.
the buses.
Right.
But still, because we put the guardrails around the emergency, right, then it kind of handles that a
Yeah,
little.
the only outlier hypothetical here is a circumstance where there is an emergency that impacts more than one board, and one or more of those boards is unable to meet, but one or more of those boards is able to meet, in which case you can have a weird result. But we're living so far in the margins at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah,
Like,
yes.
Right, right.
No, I agree. The only other thing that I would throw out there is that if there's a simple way to make a reference that makes it clear that the central office budget fits under these same guidelines. In other words, each of the boards makes a contribution to the central office budget, but we did have a finance director at one point who did make several allocations without notifying the board, in excess of $10,000, and said that that was central office budget and that was different than
right, and they were right.
well,
But presumably, like,
we
the
still
board
need guardrails.
should know enough to say, well, I've got my piece of this if it's central office. And that those guidelines, that governance is in place to capture that.
I mean, and that's where you almost, this is where it gets to a situation where we have these bespoke issues that are relevant just to us, because the statute doesn't consider transfers within an allocation to a shared resource. And there's a little p policy question for the 21 board members, which is, do you want to restrict central office from moving money within the $2 million that's allocated to it? And if yes, how do you do that across 3 independent policies? You probably have to create subcategories, and then those subcategories, each of the board would have to approve transfers within that. But is the transfer threshold a third? Because then it would be 3,300 from each district. There's nested questions that run into this before you even sit down to draft it.
Yeah, I realize it's difficult, but I guess, I think we're all aware that we had a salaried position in the central office budget, and the position was not hired, but we spent the money. So, I think we need to do, do I have a problem with central office having flexibility to move monies as they deem appropriate within categories and stuff? No. Do I think that the board would not allow them to, make choices and have some, again, flexibility with how they spend the money as it's been allocated? No, I don't think we would have any problem with that. But I do think there needs to be, again, something, because if there are no guardrails on central office, we're very fortunate. We have a great staff now, but again, the same situation like we talked about with the others. If we have an inexperienced board and the wrong administrators, things can be purchased.
Your exposure is limited to some percentage of $700,000 each, basically, more or less. And now, but just sort of to use your example, Mike, of we have allocated X dollars for a person. We didn't hire the person. Do we want to put guardrails around that money that requires sort of some sort of notice. You can take paragraph 3 here and you can invert it. And you can say, in addition, the superintendent may not take funds allocated for personnel and apply it to anything else without advance notice to the board. And by doing that, it doesn't matter whether it's a central office or anywhere else, but it covers the central office use case.
Yeah, but to me, then, I'm asking for the guardrails, and then I'm feeling like that makes it harder, because if you employed someone who, their salary was less than what was appropriated, could they?
I agree.
The excess.
If I budget 80,000 and I hire for 60,000, can I spend the 20,000?
Yeah.
And that's a policy
But-
question for the board to decide.
Yeah,
But-
I'm just looking for some very broad guardrails to prevent the catastrophic stuff, I guess.
I also think we need the guardrails, not for the current administration, but for a future administration and future boards. I think it's wise for us to figure out some controls there. I think just for the benefit of those who are listening in, this is a situation that was 3 years ago. We had approved a data analyst. I, for one, was very outspoken about how valuable I think that role would be, and was disappointed that we didn't hire. In large part, we weren't able to get there because of the pandemic and the number of personnel changes at the top and sort of all that. But I still to this day think it wasn't great that money got spent elsewhere without it really being reviewed by the boards.
Now, is the reason why, I'm just trying to, is the reason why because it's technically in the same line item category? Like, why did that happen? Because if you're saying, and I was there, but I don't remember, but if you were saying it was in line, was for the data analyst, which is arguably a different level than what ultimately the school did or the district didn't do.
That's not
But
a
that's still
category.
personnel, like, so you're saying beyond line item transfers, we want the guardrails to check whether or not central office wants to allocate unspent funds, if you will, within the same line item? Because how
I
would we
think the
not
question-
capture that in the line item transfer?
I think the issue is that central office is a line, and within central office, there are personnel, supplies, overhead, and everything else.
Yeah.
It's as if you took Reading Elementary School and called it a line.
I got it. So you're asking for, then it's kind of saying within the line item of central office, and that presumes that the systems we have are always going to show it
Right.
a central office allocation, right? You could have a future scenario where we use XYZ system and then it's broken out beyond central office, right? So, but if we want to solve for what we're trying to find now, then it's essentially, for central office line item, right? And this is where the potential categories come into play. Then because it's one line item transfer, we would want to know any unutilized or reallocated funding, if you will, even though it's in the same line.
Yeah.
They were creating an exception only for central office, and then the
Right.
rest.
You almost have to draft language that says that with respect to the board's allocation to the ER9 central office, the same categories shall be impliedly required to be observed, so that any transfers in those categories within the central office allocation shall require the approval of the 3 boards.
I like that.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I wonder if now would be the time that we seek some input from Dr. McKinnon, because I think while we have this unique situation of a sort of a battle-worn set of board members and an amazing superintendent and director of finance, that it would be really nice to get their input about, here are the ways in which this may handcuff us in sort of negative ways that I think none of you would like, and how can we craft it so that it doesn't do that, but does give us the kind of controls that we think are necessary.
Right.
Yeah, and to Mike's point earlier, lots of districts around the state do this lots of different ways. So there's no one right way. There's just the way that it's going to make us all collectively the most comfortable. And I get the sense from our current administration that they would welcome certain reasonable guidelines so that it's, show me the paint by numbers to how I'm supposed to handle the situation. I'm happy to do it that way, as long as you're not, monitoring every penny, because that's just an administrative burden.
Yeah.
So,
Makes sense to me.
so do we want to ask the administration for comment on this policy generally, as well as the categories that we want to assign? And use that as a jumping off point?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and you probably want to explain the superintendent a little bit of what the discussion centered around and what his feeling is on that.
Add a note in that one area.
Which area am I adding a note?
So about the controls for central office, I mean, we're not like adding a paragraph, but we need to put some context to it,
Because I almost feel like even, the part with the $10,000 approval, transfer approval, even that, being, a requirement of central office budget as well, at least it provides that notification, right? It allows them, if there was a situation and they needed to transfer it, that's fine, but at least the board would know, and you would know before it was done, I don't know.
Well, I think to recognize in the policy that central office exists and needs to be held to the same guidelines is important.
And we'll have to cross the bridge as to what the transfer threshold is, and if it's $10,000, it's effectively $3,300. And I don't even want to cross the bridge of what happens if two boards say yes and one board says no.
Well, yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So I added this to our to-do list as well. So we've got the link to the document and all that.
Can I just have two other questions to this, is if we're going to go to the administration. Do we need to define fiscal authority up top for Region 9? I know you added that language, Chris, as to the you added up top. For regional school district, the itemized estimate shall be prepared for approval by the voters of Reading and Easton. Board of Finance is defined as the fiscal authority, and then underneath the itemized list, it says it refers again to fiscal authority.
Yeah, but
just to
this is Cheryl's ad, and I agree. And I think if you scroll down, there's a whole regional version of this.
Yes,
which includes some additional stuff, but also kind of the same bread and butter piece of it, including also language for that is otherwise applicable to boards of finance. So I don't think we're going to be able to fully merge these necessarily. But I think we need to merge, or at least come to an accord on the substantive issues with respect to transfers. Because if we can do that, then it's easy enough to plug that information into the relevant language that goes into sort of the work stream of the two fiscal authorities.
perfect. I'm just noting that the fiscal authority, if that we just need to be sensitive that they're different, and you wouldn't want it to be confusing for anybody.
Right.
Then,
this is one where you could create a complete mess if you do it wrong. So
right. And then on your, I believe this was your note, Chris, on item 3 on the last, well, it's not the last, it's the last page in the local version.
Yeah.
The superintendent may not make an intercategory or intercategory transfer that results in an increase in staff of 1.0 FTE or more without advanced approval of the board. That is, and I understand the intent, but is that, in theory, you could do, does this mean you could do like 4.5 FTEs without approval? I guess is that okay? Does this accomplish? I guess I'm just asking, is this clear as to hiring, as to staff, increase of staff?
Maybe. I mean, I guess it sort of depends a little bit on what the intended guardrail is, because I could conceive of a situation where you've got somebody who's teaching at a 0.6 and you want to bump them up to a 0.8, and you have the money to do it because you hired them at a step 5 instead of a step 8, and enrollment demands it. Are you getting the board involved for that? 'Cause it doesn't change headcount.
Right. That, to me, that's not the issue that this would solve for. The issue this potentially might be, you could make an intercategory, in theory, an intercategory transfer that resulted in an entirely new staff member, a 0.5 FTE.
Well,
And
you're not doing that because it's going to be more than $10,000 to do that. So you're not doing that without approval anyway, on an intercategory basis.
Okay, good. So that's good.
Right. This is a further limitation of the transfer right. So it's
all-
saying that
Number one applies to this is not independent of number one.
no, it is consumed by that. So even if you could transfer $9,000 without advance approval because you want to hire another para for the recess monitor, you can't do it without approval because that's a change in FTE of 1, in theory.
Okay, it doesn't, when I read it, because it doesn't fall under necessarily number 1, because it's not like 1A. It seems like it might potentially stand alone.
I mean, it's subject to the following requirements. So, I mean,
If would you have understood it better, Kathy, if we said subject to all of the following requirements?
Yes. I think.
I was going to make these conjunctive to each.
Because to be honest, when I read it, to me, it did not seem connected. It wasn't necessarily connected to number 1. It seemed to be its own standalone possibility.
Is the language in 3 statutory as well?
No, it's completely invented by me.
Okay. No,
There's
Okay.
nothing about this in the statute. This is based on practice and the sort of awkward language in the policy that exists.
and is the intent, is the desired intent to kind of put guardrails around, expenses relating to like insurance and things like that? So if you hired a new employee and the board was not aware, and then your insurance, goes up and that, or is it just simply to kind of?
I don't know the history of the rule. I just know that the rule existed and there had always been sort of a known sensitivity to adding people. And so I carried forward that sensitivity without regard to its purpose.
But the 1.0 as opposed to what triggers benefits? Anything over 0.6 or something, or point? Is that what?
Points. I don't know it's might be 0.8, but
0.8?
But the 1.0 FTE was, I needed to put something in there, and I didn't want to just say head count because that can mean a lot of things.
Right. I mean, it's not that I dislike it. I'm just trying to figure out how.
It's here for discussion. I am
Right.
pretty agnostic on it.
Because we do get in situations like that, and we do have history at Region 9 as well, where there was a consultant and maybe a 0.5 or a 0.6 person, and then next thing you know, you do have a 1.0 for the same amount of money. So
And so is this language meant to address increasing an existing staff member from, for example, a 0.6 to a 0.8, it does not cover, we're going to hire a new 0.5.
It's intended to prevent hiring a new person off the street to fill a role that is not otherwise budgeted for.
Right.
So
to the previous point where if we don't have any of this language, it's not allowed, should we leave it out altogether?
So here's where it comes into play a little bit. Let's say that you have 5 second grade teachers budgeted, right? And you expect that that's going to cost $500,000 total. And it turns out that 2 of those teachers leave over the summer and are replaced by 2 that cost you $50,000 each. Now I have suddenly another $100,000 floating around within that category already allocated to second grade teachers. I can go in and I can hire a 6th second grade teacher. And now I have exactly the same allocation within the same category, but I've increased headcount by one FTE. The question is, do we want to prohibit that without advanced board approval, or do we want to allow that to happen in the background without advanced board approval?
Yeah. I don't dislike it, or I guess I like it, better way of saying it, but I also, feel like that, historically, this is something that, again, is creating greater transparency, which I think is what we're all striving is, again, not putting too many, barriers around, whatever needed flexibility in spending is there for the administration, but also making sure that, that you're not hiring additional staff members, because that does get tricky, because next thing you know, your health insurance is running over and you're not sure why, and there are 2 employees that you weren't aware of, and it can happen with a lot of different things. And I think it's more about creating that awareness than saying we don't want you to have any flexibility with hiring staff.
You could simplify the language and just say the superintendent may not make any intercategory or intercategory changes. You could even get rid of all of that. You could say under no circumstances shall the superintendent hire more personnel than have been, specifically allocated in the budget, basically, which you're really trying to get at, which is a tighter guardrail, because even my example of second grade teachers fails because I've allocated $500,000 for second grade teachers. It's not even a intra-category transfer. It's a line non-transfer.
Although I could imagine, like, I feel less sensitive about adding another recess aide, adding another lunch aide, and things like that, as opposed to a certified staff or paras, things like that.
Because you're going to have a situation where you go to a student moves into the district, needs a one-to-one para. You've got to increase your para headcount by 1 to meet that.
Right.
You got to go to the board and say, I need a formal approval to add this person because I need to put the person there.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
In theory, this policy prohibits that.
Right.
And it really doesn't. It's not really obstructive in that the superintendent can come to the board and detail the rationale behind whatever staffing change they want to employ, and so this doesn't really prevent it. It just you need the approval, which I think in the obvious circumstances is always going to be granted by the board.
Like another hypothetical is I'm removing staff. I'm removing a building secretary to add a building nurse. You're creating a transfer there, but you're net you're the same on FTEs. Oh, you're talking, because that would be covered by this, because it doesn't say it's a net increase in staff.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, no, I mean, are we looking, Kathy and Mike, it seems like you have the broadest concerns, right? So I think I'm hearing you don't feel, neither of you feel comfortable that the wording provides the appropriate guardrails that you're seeking, right? Is that fair? You could
Well-
nod if that's the case.
Well, I guess I'm not clear what this exactly means. So it may or it may not. I read it, and maybe this is not an accurate reading, but I read it to mean that the superintendent may not make a transfer of funds that results in an increase in staff of over 1.0 FTE. So I read that to mean they could actually transfer funds to create an increase in staff of 0.9, for example, which could mean you bump somebody from a 0.5 to a 0.9, or you hired a brand new person, is how I read this. But because I didn't assume that it fell under number one with those limitations and funds. So I'm just.
But be careful, because number one is only intercategory. And if you have money under salary and personnel, that would always be intra-category.
Yes, and yes, that adds another piece to it. So I'm just trying to understand exactly what it limits, and maybe everybody else is clear. To me, this seemed like you could do you could do quite a bit potentially.
You could do 3.6 in hires and.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, I see the point, because I think, I mean, ultimately, the guardrail that I would want is maybe an easier way is incremental headcount, right? So if we're talking about, and these are completely arbitrary numbers. You've got 100 people in Region 9, 100 people in Reading, 100 people in Easton, right? And so what we're trying, I think, to solve for, and where perhaps there is consensus among this group, is how do I know that 300 is not going to turn into 325 because we do it via, 0.2 here and 0.3 there and point blah, 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 right? So then maybe the solve is, total headcount, right? If that equates to more than flat, essentially, right? Then the administration has to go to the respective board. Any change in headcount, essentially. What we're saying, even if it's intra-district, right? Because then if they say, oh no, we need a science teacher in Easton, we don't need in Reading because enrollment went down, let's transfer this FTE to, again, assuming we can do that, right? That would essentially be, but net we're still at 300. That's not incremental cost to the taxpayers, but that is an incremental cost to one district over another. So like what kind of guardrails do we want? Are we talking about just dollars spent and total FTE, or are we talking about intra-district?
I mean, to a certain extent now we're going beyond a budget transfer policy and into a hiring policy. And that's where we're blurring the line a little bit. And I think that maybe the answer is that this doesn't belong in the transfer policy at all. And the hiring policy says that the superintendent shall never increase headcount without advance approval of the board. Or something to that, or and then in here you have to sort of cross-reference that and say, subject also to the restrictions found in policy on hiring.
It's tricky because, then I'm thinking, is it certified staff or is it, because that's where you go back to, if we had 3 part-time lunch paras and they want to hire a full-time and a 0.2, like, so I don't want to make it.
I mean, that regard, Mike, that would be certified to non-certified, right? So that would be covered in the line item transfer, right? But in the certified to certified or non-cert to non-cert across districts, this wording wouldn't capture that.
No, I know. I guess what I'm saying, I feel differently about hiring a science teacher than I do about, cafeteria para or something. But again, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that this rule is in a lot of other districts' policies, and I think it's possibly because it is naughty. And it's hard to sort of capture what I think is the intent here.
And again, to your point of, is it hiring or is it budgetary? You could do something like the superintendent will notify the boards of any intent to and staffing changes, beyond budgeted, whatever. But now you're putting hiring in.
Yeah, I mean, like so many things in these policies, these provisions get written to solve for something that happened in the past that annoyed people.
Yeah.
And they say, how can I prevent that from happening again? And then somebody finds a way around that, and you're back at it drafting again, and welcome to like every statute that's ever been written.
Yeah, I agree. It boils down to having the right people because the rules only work if they're followed, I guess.
I mean, to put it another way, is it concisely the consensus of the group that there should be a policy that prohibits the net increase of staff as a head count? Because I could add a teacher and cut a lunchroom monitor and get to a similar place, which I don't think is what we're trying to have either. Like, what's the little p policy goal that we're trying to draft for?
Yeah, I think that you're sort of teasing at it right there. I added a note on this in the to-do list to, sort of discuss our stance on hiring of additional personnel, whether we're talking about certified staff or otherwise. And I think this is one of those, another area where Dr. McKinnon and Dr. Pearson, you all's points of views would be really useful to tell us, hey, look, here's how it happened. And frankly, I could imagine Kim Fox Santora giving me quite an education on here's how it really works when it comes to paras, here's how it really works when it comes to cafeteria aides, et cetera. And maybe their involvement will really help us to sort of zero in on, okay, here's the thing that we're concerned about.
I mean, because you might solve it by saying any increase in the number of employees eligible for health insurance benefits. Like, that's an awkward way of saying it, but it kind of gets to the point.
Right. Totally gets to it.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to continue to ponder this. I think we've been going for quite a while tonight. So
No, I think we bring that one to Dr. McKinnon and have him look it over with Stephanie and see what their thoughts are.
Well, and thank you, Chris, for taking a crack at it, because it's not easy, and thank you.
yeah, I mean, we got to start somewhere. So I'm happy to put some language down to discuss.
And they may even share their language with us or their preferences with us, and then we take it to Shipman and go to it, and Shipman's like, no, this will not work. So, so we will see.
All right.
So unless anyone else has another item to add, I think we have 3 takeaways. Does anyone have anything that we want to add here? So my proposal is that we sort of send the link, and I can send the link to this document and sort of point their attention there on those 3 rows we talked about tonight. And then that when we meet again, that we're ready to discuss their input and sort of choose a course of action and recommendations to the boards. Does that seem reasonable?
Yep.
Okay. Great. Well, then, unless there's an objection, I think that would move us into committee member comment.
I hope the disembodied voice of John Simpson feels better soon.
Thank you.
I have a comment or suggestion or just reminder to all of us. I think at some point we were going to try to figure out schedule for the remaining policies that we're trying to synchronize, simplify, et cetera. So just maybe next agenda would be a kind of agenda item.
I like that.
And Sarah, for Region 9, will when we get the input back from Shipman as to our legacy list, maybe we meet separately, just us Region 9 people, to go through that and keep working on cleaning that up.
for sure.
Hmm.
I'm not sure exactly what the date will be just yet, but it'll hopefully be in the early part of the new year, early part of the month. And my goal was then I can reach out to both of you, we can review it or whatever, and then maybe we can even take it to our board meeting later in the month if the timing works out.
That whole first week of January is open from board meetings right now, which is sort of a rare opportunity to, but, and Mike hates it, but
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, and I do hate it, but I don't, I would be reluctant to put special board meetings in those times, how we
No, that's
kind of open them up for administration to give them a little leeway, so,
I was suggesting this group work to figure
This
out
policy.
what our schedule looks like and how we break up the work, not involve administration and distract them from getting the budget finalized that week.
yeah, I think we need to kind of pause on the agendas are gonna be loaded with budget related, discussions, so.
Good. If there's no additional committee member comment, I'll look for a motion to adjourn for the joint committee.
So moved.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:47 PM.
Thank you.
I will move to adjourn for the Region 9 committee as well at 6:47 PM. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you, everyone. Happy holidays. Happy New Year.
holidays.
New Year.
Happy
Stay
holidays.
healthy.
Thank you. Yeah.